Right now, at this exact moment, massive fires are erupting across Saudi Arabia's eastern oil fields as Iranian-designed drones rain down on critical petroleum infrastructure that supplies 8% of global oil consumption. Saudi Aramco claims these are precision strikes targeting active production facilities, not storage tanks. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps posts on social media that the attacks represent defensive retaliation for unspecified American provocations. But here's what makes this unprecedented. These aren't the crude Shahed 136 kamikaze drones we've seen in Ukraine. Intelligence assessments suggest these are advanced reconnaissance strike platforms with autonomous targeting capabilities, meaning they selected their own targets after launch. This is the first confirmed use of AI-enabled weapons in a direct attack on the world's most critical energy infrastructure during what was supposed to be a diplomatic cooling-off period. Let me walk you through exactly what happened in the last 6 hours. At 0347 hours local time on Tuesday, March 18, 2026, radar operators at Saudi Arabia's Eastern Province Air Defense Command detected multiple low-altitude contacts approaching from the northeast, originating from Iranian territory approximately 280 kilometers across the Persian Gulf. The contacts were moving at 180 kilometers per hour at altitudes between 50 and 150 meters, classic profile for terrain-hugging drone penetration. At 0351 hours, Saudi F-15SA fighters scrambled from King Abdulaziz Air Base, but the drones had already crossed into Saudi airspace. At 0356 hours, the first impacts occurred at the Abqaiq processing facility, the world's largest oil processing complex, handling 7 million barrels per day. Satellite thermal imaging from commercial providers detected heat signatures consistent with multiple fires across a 2-3 square kilometer area. At 0402 hours, secondary strikes hit the Khurais oil field 150 kilometers southwest of Abqaiq, one of Saudi Arabia's largest production centers, pumping 1.5 million barrels daily. At 0408 hours, additional impacts were recorded at the Sheba field near the empty quarter, suggesting a coordinated strike package hitting geographically dispersed targets simultaneously. By 0430 hours, Saudi Air Defense claimed successful interception of 12 additional drones, but damage assessment teams were reporting catastrophic fires at all 3 primary target locations. Current status as of this recording: fires continue burning at Abqaiq with damage estimates still preliminary, Khurais facility partially shut down as precautionary measure, and Sheba reporting structural damage to separation units that could affect production for weeks. To understand why this attack represents a strategic earthquake, you need to understand what actually hit these facilities. These weren't the Shahed 136 loitering munitions that Russia uses in Ukraine, those simple one-way attack drones with 50-kilogram warheads flying pre-programmed GPS routes. Intelligence analysis suggests Iran deployed either the Shahed 149 Gaza or a variant we haven't seen publicly before. The Shahed 149 is a medium-altitude, long-endurance platform with a wingspan exceeding 21 meters, roughly the size of an American MQ-9 Reaper. This drone carries precision-guided munitions, not just a suicide warhead. It can loiter over target areas for up to 35 hours at altitudes up to 35,000 feet, though these flew low to evade radar. The critical difference is the targeting system. Open-source intelligence from Iranian defense publications suggests the latest variants incorporate synthetic aperture radar and electro-optical targeting pods with automatic target recognition algorithms. This means the drone can identify specific infrastructure types, valve clusters, separation towers, control buildings, and select precise aim points without human intervention after launch. The warhead is likely a 100-kilogram class penetrator with delayed fusing, designed to punch through industrial structures before detonating inside, maximizing internal damage rather than external blast effects. Iran's operational doctrine here mirrors what we've seen in Yemen, where Houthi forces using Iranian-supplied systems have struck Saudi oil facilities multiple times since 2019. But this attack demonstrates a capability evolution. Previous strikes used cruise missiles or older drone variants requiring continuous operator control. This attack suggests fire-and-forget autonomous operation where Iranian commanders programmed target coordinates, launched the swarm, and the drones handled terminal attack phase independently. From a defensive perspective, this creates a nightmare scenario. Saudi Arabia operates Patriot missile batteries and American-supplied Raytheon Coyote counter-drone systems, but those are optimized for high-value threats like ballistic missiles or expensive to intercept fast-moving cruise missiles. Engaging cheap drones with million-dollar interceptors creates economic imbalance Iran deliberately exploits. The Saudis shot down 12 drones according to their claims, but at what cost per kill? If each intercept consumed a $4 million Patriot missile against a $100,000 drone, Iran achieved a 40-to-1 cost-exchange ratio before the drones even struck targets. Here's the strategic calculation driving this attack and why it happened now. From Iran's perspective, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia represents the primary Sunni Arab counterweight to Iranian regional influence. Every barrel of Saudi oil sold at market rates funds military capabilities, intelligence operations, and political influence that directly opposes Tehran's strategic objectives across the Middle East. Iran cannot match Saudi Arabia's conventional military spending. Riyadh's 2026 defense budget exceeds $75 billion, while Iran's entire government budget struggles under sanctions pressure. So Iran pursues asymmetric strategies, drones, missiles, proxy forces, and attacks on economic infrastructure that impose disproportionate costs on wealthy adversaries. According to Dr. Afshan Ostavar, Associate Professor of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School and author of Vanguard of the Imam, Religion, Politics, and Iran's Revolutionary Guards, Iran's strategy is not to win conventional wars, but to make its adversaries' conventional superiority irrelevant through unconventional means. The timing of this strike is equally calculated. Diplomatic talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia, mediated by China, were scheduled to resume in Beijing on March 22, just 4 days from now. Iran's hardline faction, which never supported rapprochement with Riyadh, may be deliberately sabotaging the diplomatic track. Or alternatively, Iran may be demonstrating capability before negotiations, establishing that it can inflict economic pain and therefore must be taken seriously at the bargaining table. This is classic coercive diplomacy. Hurt your opponent to demonstrate you can hurt them worse, then offer to stop hurting them in exchange for concessions. From Saudi Arabia's perspective, this attack represents an existential threat to the economic model sustaining the kingdom. Oil revenue accounts for roughly 42% of Saudi GDP and funds the massive social programs preventing domestic instability. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's Vision 2030 Economic Diversification Plan requires continued oil revenue to finance the transition away from oil dependence, a paradox that makes Saudi Arabia vulnerable during the transformation period. The kingdom cannot afford prolonged production disruptions. Global oil markets opened this morning with Brent crude spiking 11% to $94 per barrel on news of the attacks, demonstrating how tightly balanced supply and demand remain. If Abqaiq stays offline for weeks rather than days, prices could spike above $110, triggering global recession fears and political crisis for oil-importing nations. This gives Iran tremendous leverage. The strategic context also involves the United States, though American forces weren't directly targeted. The United States maintains significant military presence in the Gulf, supporting Saudi Arabia and other partners. The Fifth Fleet headquarters sits in Bahrain, just across the water from these burning oil fields. American Patriot batteries defend Saudi territory. American intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets monitored these drones in flight. Washington now faces a decision. Does it escalate involvement in Saudi Arabia's defense, potentially triggering direct confrontation with Iran? Or does it maintain strategic distance, potentially undermining partner confidence in American security commitments? According to Michael Knights, Jill and Jay Bernstein Fellow at the Washington Institute focused on Gulf states' military affairs, the United States has deliberately avoided getting dragged into the Saudi-Iran conflict, viewing it as a regional dispute where American forces serve as deterrent presence rather than active combatants. But if Iran continues escalating attacks on infrastructure that affects global energy markets and therefore American economic interests, that distinction becomes harder to maintain. Russia and China also factor into these calculations. Moscow benefits from higher oil prices, boosting Russian export revenue despite Western sanctions. Beijing, which mediated previous Saudi-Iran talks, has economic interests in Gulf stability, but also strategic interests in demonstrating that Chinese diplomacy can resolve conflicts where American approaches failed. Both powers are watching how this unfolds, calibrating their own regional strategies based on whether violence escalates or diplomacy prevails. There are three scenarios for how this crisis develops over the next week, and I'm going to give you probabilities for each based on current trajectories. Scenario 1 is diplomatic damage control with rapid de-escalation. Probability 35%. In this scenario, both Saudi Arabia and Iran recognize they've reached a dangerous threshold and pull back from further confrontation. Saudi Arabia conducts limited retaliatory airstrikes against Iranian-linked targets in Yemen or Iraqi proxy positions, demonstrating it won't accept attacks without response but avoiding strikes on Iranian territory itself. Iran accepts this proportional retaliation without further escalation. China intensifies mediation efforts, potentially moving the scheduled Beijing talks forward to this week rather than waiting until Friday. Both sides agree to confidence-building measures. Iran commits to restraining proxy forces. Saudi Arabia commits to limiting its own support for anti-Iranian groups in the region. The United States remains publicly neutral while privately pressuring Riyadh to accept diplomatic off-ramp. For this scenario to succeed, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman must be willing to absorb domestic criticism for not retaliating more forcefully, and Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei must constrain hardliners demanding continued attacks. Oil prices stabilize as markets price in reduced conflict probability. Abqaiq repairs proceed without additional interference, and production gradually restores over 3 to 4 weeks. The key indicator for this scenario, if Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi makes an emergency trip to Riyadh or Tehran within 48 hours, diplomatic track remains viable. Scenario 2 is controlled escalation with tit-for-tat strikes. Probability 45%. This is the most likely near-term trajectory. Saudi Arabia launches retaliatory strikes not just against proxies but against Iranian positions, possibly targeting IRGC facilities in Syria where Iranian forces operate openly, or hitting Iranian naval assets in the Gulf. Iran responds with additional drone or missile strikes against Saudi targets, but both sides calibrate attacks to inflict pain without crossing thresholds that trigger all-out war. Neither side targets the other's capital cities or leadership directly. Neither side causes mass civilian casualties that would create overwhelming pressure for regime-changing retaliation. This becomes a war of attrition where each side demonstrates capability and resolve while avoiding mutual destruction. The United States increases defensive support for Saudi Arabia, deploying additional Patriot batteries and potentially THAAD anti-missile systems, but avoids offensive operations against Iran. Oil markets remain volatile, with prices fluctuating between $90 and $110 per barrel depending on daily strike reports. This scenario could persist for weeks or months, becoming the new normal rather than acute crisis. The risk is that controlled escalation eventually spins out of control through accident, miscalculation, or deliberate choice by hardliners. The key indicator: if Saudi Arabia strikes targets inside Iran within 72 hours but avoids Tehran and leadership compounds, we're in controlled escalation mode. Scenario 3 is catastrophic escalation spiraling toward regional war. Probability 20%. This nightmare scenario emerges if either side miscalculates or domestic political pressures force leaders into corners where restraint becomes impossible. Saudi Arabia launches massive retaliatory strikes against Iran's oil infrastructure, naval bases, and potentially nuclear facilities, arguing that Iran's nuclear program represents existential threat requiring preventive action. Iran responds by closing the Strait of Hormuz, through which 21% of global oil flows, mining the waterway and threatening any vessel attempting passage. Iranian missiles strike American bases across the Gulf, killing American service members and triggering direct U.S. military response. Hezbollah in Lebanon launches rocket barrages against Israeli cities under Iranian direction, opening second front and bringing Israel into the conflict. Within a week, we see American stealth bombers striking Iranian nuclear sites, Iranian ballistic missiles hitting Saudi desalination plants and power grids, and naval battles in the Persian Gulf as Iran's Revolutionary Guard speedboats swarm American warships. Oil prices spike above $150 per barrel, triggering global recession. The Biden administration faces political crisis as American casualties mount and gasoline prices double domestically. Regional countries choose sides, with UAE and Bahrain supporting Saudi American coalition, while Iraq struggles to prevent Iranian-backed militias from using Iraqi territory to attack American forces. This scenario remains least likely because both sides understand the catastrophic costs, but low-probability catastrophic outcomes still merit serious planning. The key indicator: if Iran threatens Strait of Hormuz closure within 48 hours, or if American carrier strike groups begin moving toward the Gulf rather than maintaining Arabian Sea positioning, catastrophic escalation probability increases dramatically. Watch for 5 critical signals in the next 24 to 72 hours that will reveal which trajectory we're on. First, satellite imagery of Abqaiq facility. If commercial imagery shows repair equipment and firefighting progress, markets will stabilize and diplomatic solutions become more feasible. If imagery shows expanding damage or secondary explosions, panic intensifies. Second, Chinese diplomatic activity. If Beijing announces emergency mediation mission or moves talks forward, diplomatic track remains viable. If China stays silent or issues pro forma statements without action, diplomacy is failing. Third, American military movements. Monitor whether additional Patriot batteries deploy to Saudi Arabia, whether carrier strike groups shift positions, whether B-2 bomber deployments to regional bases occur. Each signals escalating American involvement. Fourth, Iranian domestic messaging. If Supreme Leader Khamenei gives public address, his language reveals whether Iran seeks off-ramp or confrontation. Rhetoric about final victory and crushing arrogance suggests escalation, while emphasis on strategic patience and diplomatic solutions suggests de-escalation preference. Fifth, oil market behavior beyond initial spike. If prices settle back toward 85-90 range within 48 hours, markets are pricing in conflict resolution. If prices continue climbing or volatility increases, markets expect sustained or escalating conflict. I am tracking this minute by minute through satellite imagery providers, Gulf-based security sources, and real-time monitoring of diplomatic channels. When the next development breaks, whether Saudi Arabia retaliates, whether China mediates, whether fires at Abqaiq spread or get contained, you will understand it here first with the technical depth and strategic context mainstream media will not provide. Subscribe to this channel right now. Turn on all notifications. The next 72 hours will determine whether we're heading toward diplomatic resolution or the largest oil crisis since the 1970s embargo, with global economic implications affecting every person watching this video. Hit that subscribe button because you need to understand what happens next, and I will explain it as it unfolds. Drop a comment right now. Do you think Saudi Arabia will strike Iranian territory directly or limit retaliation to proxy targets? Do you think China's mediation can actually work, or is this crisis beyond diplomatic solution? Do you think oil prices will spike above $100 and stay there, or will markets stabilize once initial panic subsides? I read every comment, and I want to know what you're seeing from your perspective. The fires are still burning. The drones demonstrated capability we have not seen before. Iran and Saudi Arabia are at a threshold neither wanted to reach, but neither can ignore. What happens in the next 3 days will determine whether 2026 becomes the year oil markets collapsed and regional war erupted, or whether diplomacy pulled us back from the edge one more time. Thanks for watching. The strike just happened. The retaliation is being planned. The clock is ticking on decisions that will affect billions of people. Stay with me.